From 1964 to 1967, I successfully impersonated an airline pilot for Pan Am Airways, and I flew over 2 million miles for free. During that time, I was also the chief resident pediatrician at a Georgia hospital and an assistant attorney general for the state of Louisiana. By the time I was caught, I was considered the youngest and most daring con man in U.S. history. I had cashed almost $4 million in fraudulent checks in 26 foreign countries and all 50 states. And I did it all before my 19th birthday. My name is Frank William Abagnale.
Frank Abagnale Jr. has one of those unbelievable life stories where as soon as you hear it, you think, oh my God, that would make for a great movie. And you'd be right. And you also wouldn't be alone in thinking that. Abagnale first sold the film rights to his story in 1980 to late producer Bud Yorkin and, of all people, Norman Lear. Yorkin and Lear sold the rights to Columbia Pictures, who then sold them to producer Hal Bartlett. Bartlett died before the film could be made, so the rights were sold to the now-defunct Hollywood Pictures, which was an arm of Disney. There, the movie went into turnaround and was sold to a subdivision of TriStar. In 1990, the rights were bought by a producer for Paramount, and then in 1997, they were bought by producer Barry Kemp, who finally brought the project to DreamWorks, one of Steven Spielberg's companies. By the way, you know that's what this little S stands for, right? Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, David Geffen, the company's founders. So yes, you hear Frank Abagnale's story and you immediately think that it would make a great movie, but I think that constant changing of hands of the story over the 2 decades journey to the screen is indicative of something that a lot of people may take for granted. An interesting and compelling life story doesn't automatically make for an interesting and compelling movie. Like, Louis Zamperini maybe had the most interesting life of the 20th century, and the movie made about his life was fine. Like, it was all right. A screenplay has to be interesting, and interesting things have to happen, but it also has to be more than just a series of disconnected events, no matter how interesting those events may be, because that's just unsatisfying. It works so much better when it's cohesive or has some sort of unifying theme, and I kind of think that may be what was missing from Unbroken. So how does Catch Me If You Can go right where Unbroken went wrong? Frank's story is held together by cohesive thematic through lines, namely trust and deception, and the plot and themes are always filtered through the lens of his relationships. The first 2 scenes are Frank and Carl in France in 1969, and then Frank and his father, Frank Sr., in New York in 1966. The movie wastes no time in introducing us to the 2 most important relationships in Frank's life, the FBI agent pursuing him and his father. But before we see these 2 scenes, we actually see a prologue of sorts with Frank as a contestant on To Tell the Truth. By the way, Frank Abagnale actually did appear on this game show in 1977. This prologue tells us in the first 45 seconds pretty much everything we're about to see. He impersonates an airline pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer, and he passes $4 million in fraudulent checks. The dramatic question of the movie is not an if or a will, it's a how and a why. The 2 opening scenes tell us that he gets caught, but seeing the cut from the long-haired, bearded prisoner in France to a bright-eyed kid in a sports coat in New York makes us immediately wonder how. And hearing them list his credentials in the To Tell the Truth intro makes us immediately wonder how. The mechanics of how are very entertaining to watch, but the real answer to how is one of the themes holding the story together: deception.
You know why the Yankees always win, Frank?
Because they have Mickey Mantle?
No, it's because the other teams can't stop staring at those damn pinstripes.
When I first saw this movie when I was like 12, I just thought that was like a cool, clever line, and a smart way to show how Carl ultimately learns Frank's identity.
Why New York? The Yankees. He said something about the Yankees.
But really, this line is effectively a thesis statement on how Frank is able to pull all of this off. A reminder of context. Frank Sr. takes Frank to get a black suit, pulls some strings in order to get it for him, and then poses Frank as his driver. to make Frank Sr. look wealthier and more important than he is, so that the bank he's about to walk into is more likely to give him the loan that he so desperately needs. It's a keeping up appearances thing. What Frank Sr. means with the pinstripe line is that if you look the part, you can pull the wool over people's eyes.
Oh, people only know what you tell them, Carl.
Frank posing as a driver is Frank Sr.'s pinstripes. At the start of Act 2, Frank tries to pass checks using all kinds of stories, but none of them work.
It's my grandmother's birthday next week, and I want to get her something extra special. Please, it's my midterm next week, and my books were stolen. Please, it's just $5. No one would have to know.
I'm sorry, but we are not allowed to take checks from people we don't know.
But then he sees how people treat this pilot, and he finds his pinstripes. Once he has the Pan Am uniform and looks the part, people are falling over themselves to cash checks for him. By the way, the real Frank Abagnale says this movie is maybe 70 to 80% accurate, but the part about him getting the uniform is apparently true. He really just called up Pan Am, pretended to be a pilot who lost his uniform, and they gave him one. Frank similarly uses the fake it and you'll make it deception throughout the rest of his story. He acts convincingly enough like a doctor, people buy that he's a doctor. He acts convincingly enough like a lawyer, people buy that he's a lawyer. But the other side of deception is trust. You deceive people by getting them to trust you.
Your wallet.
You hang on to it for a minute. I trust you.
And trust is the thematic glue holding this movie together. Much as Frank's story may change, from a high school kid to a runaway trying to pass checks, to a fake pilot, to a fake doctor, to a fake lawyer, to a prisoner, the ever-present through line is trust. And you can point to narrative linchpins that are all centered around people putting their trust in other people, and that trust is either rewarded or not. The first act ends with Frank running away from home because his parents are getting a divorce. The scene immediately before this, Frank walks in and more or less catches his mom having an affair with Frank Sr.'s best friend, an enormous betrayal of trust. The final line of the scene serves as a button on this thematic idea, his mother breaking promises.
Promise you we're gonna quit.
So it is a betrayal of trust that makes Frank run away at the end of Act 1 and leads to the events of the movie. Later in Act 2, same thing. Frank comes to a crossroads and is about to put this life of crime behind him and marry Brenda Strong. But that's foiled when Carl and the FBI show up to his engagement party. Before he sneaks away, he confesses everything to Brenda and gives her explicit instructions to meet him at the Miami airport so they can run away together.
The international terminal in Miami. All right, say it. No matter what.
No matter what.
You're gonna take a taxi cab.
I'm gonna take a taxi.
You're gonna be there at 10 a.m.
I'll be there at 10 a.m. no matter what.
In 2 days. 2 days, Brenda.
But when he goes there to pick her up, he learns that she's betrayed his trust. And this rendezvous is actually an FBI sting. So, just like Frank responds to his mother's betrayal by running away from home, Frank responds to Brenda's betrayal by running away to Europe. And real quick, I have to point out how Frank is able to get away to Europe. He recruits a team of college-age stewardesses, and both the Miami PD and the FBI can't stop staring at his goddamn pinstripes. And then, of course, there's arguably the most crucial moment of the movie at the end of Act 2, when Frank is finally arrested in France. We notably see Carl approach alone, walking through an empty square, and he tells Frank that there are 24 French police officers outside, and that they'll shoot him if he leaves without Carl. There's 2 dramatic push-ins as Frank considers calling Carl's bluff.
Is that the truth?
Yeah.
But ultimately, Frank decides to trust that Carl is telling him the truth. And in a nice narrative head fake, it at first appears that Carl was lying, but then it's revealed that, yes, Frank's trust turns out to have been justified. And finally, the climax of the movie. Frank is serving out his sentence by working for the FBI, but old temptations rear their head, and he's ostensibly about to fly the coop. This would not only put Frank away for the rest of his life, it would make Carl look bad for how much he vouched for Frank in advocating for his supervised release. But in keeping with the theme, Carl puts his trust in Frank that he'll be back at work on Monday.
How do you know I'll come back?
Look, Frank, nobody's chasing you.
And even though Frank makes him sweat, he ultimately proves Carl right. And the movie ends, as it began, with Frank and Carl's relationship. And that's the other reason I think the movie works so well. Thematic cohesion, but also filtering everything through relationships. I said at the top that the dramatic questions of the movie are how and why. We've already covered why Frank runs away from home, but why does he do all this? Well, it all comes back to Frank Sr. As depicted in the movie, Frank Sr. has some years-long problems with the IRS. It's why he goes to the bank for that loan in Act 1. It's why Frank Sr. has to sell the car and the house. And it's kind of implied that these money problems are what lead to the marital problems. And as Frank is passing all these checks and becoming a pilot and becoming a doctor, he's constantly writing home to Frank Sr. and meets with him in person twice. And throughout these letters and in-person conversations, Frank's constant refrain is, "I'm gonna get it all back."
I'm gonna get it all back now, Daddy. I promise. I'm gonna get it all back. I'm getting it all back. All the jewelry, all the furs, everything, Dad. Everything they took from us, I'm gonna get it back.
And he's constantly alluding to Frank Sr. and his mother getting back together.
So tell Mom to pack her bags and buy a new swimsuit, because I'm taking us all to Hawaii for Christmas. When we're done eating lunch, why don't you drive on over to Mom's house, pick her up, take a little joyride. Have you tried to call her? Why don't you call her right now? Dad, why don't you call her right now? Here. Dad, just call her. Call her for me.
In Frank's mind, if he can steal enough money, it will make up for the money troubles Frank Sr. had and put his family back together. That's his why. By the way, this why is sort of foreshadowed in Act 1. In one of my favorite bits in the movie, Frank poses as a substitute French teacher on his first day of public school. But the way the movie frames it, he's pushed by a meathead jock. The same jock makes a snide comment that he looks like a teacher, so he poses as a teacher. He turns the tables on the power dynamic between him and this Letterman jacket douchebag. He uses his powers of deception in order to enact retribution for perceived wrongs, just as his fraudulent checks are retribution for the perceived wrongs of the IRS against his father. And as we see Frank's shenanigans in 1966 and 1967, we periodically return to 1969 with Frank and Carl en route back to the States from the French prison in the opening. And here Frank is constantly asking Carl about his father. When can he call his father? When can he talk to his father? And it's not until they're approaching LaGuardia does Carl tell Frank what he's been avoiding telling him.
Frank, your father is dead. I'm sorry. I didn't want to say anything till we got closer to home. He fell down some steps at Grand Central Station trying to catch a train. I didn't want to be the one to tell you.
By the way, here's a sad, ironic detail. Early in his life as a pilot, Frank buys his dad a Cadillac, but out of a combination of pride and fear of the IRS, Frank Sr. turns it down.
Do you know what would happen if the IRS found out I was driving around in a new coupe? I took the train here, Frank. I'm taking the train home.
And then, notably, Frank Sr. died because he was trying to catch a train. Understandably, Frank doesn't respond well to the news of his father's death, and understandably, he feels betrayed by Carl for keeping this information from him.
You said I could talk to him. Carl, who are you to say something like that, huh? Who are you to say something like that? You said I could talk to him.
And he broke his neck. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
And by this point, we know how Frank responds to betrayals of trust. He runs.
God almighty.
He runs to his mother's house on Long Island and sees her new husband, her new daughter, and her new life. The final nail in the coffin on Frank's dream of getting their old life back. And with that dream finally dead, Frank turns himself in. He practically runs into Carl's arms.
Carl, get me in the car, please. Get me in the car.
And that sort of seals the parental replacement in the movie. As Frank Sr. sort of recedes from Frank's life and Carl's pursuit of Frank gets more intense, it's easy to see this shift in the most important relationship in the movie. And particularly in the final 20 minutes, it's really easy to see that Carl has become a father figure to Frank in the absence of Frank Sr. He's the only one we see visiting Frank in prison, and he looks like a proud father when Frank spots check fraud. This video is part of a series called The Director Project, so I should probably talk about the director. Given the patterns you see throughout Steven Spielberg's filmography, it makes sense that he'd be the guy to make this movie with two father-son relationships at its center. Writing for Vulture, Bill Jabiri wrote that Spielberg's perspective has changed over the course of his career from that of a child to that of a father. His early films are full of the kind of awe, wonder, and elemental anxiety we associate with childhood, but by the 1990s, they become about the anxieties of parenthood. He even contends that you can see the exact moment this transformation happens, halfway through 1991's Hook, which goes from being a film about a man desperately trying to reconnect with his childhood to one about a man embracing the fact that he is a father. Abiri offers further evidence of this by pointing to one of the central arcs of my personal favorite Spielberg movie. Jurassic Park was partly about Sam Neill's kid-hating Alan Grant warming to the responsibilities of adulthood and parenthood after being stuck with the two kids in that film. Had Spielberg made that movie 10 years earlier, the story would likely have focused on the children. As it is, the adults get the character arcs. With Catch Me If You Can, Spielberg kind of has his cake and eats it too. It's a father-son relationship, twofold, and though it skews towards the son's perspective, it's effectively with an adult son. And maybe it's no accident that when Spielberg was making this movie, his oldest son was 17, roughly the same age as Frank. So maybe the idea of a son growing up and leaving home and entering the world was on Spielberg's mind. And if that's not enough to convince you that this was a very personal movie for Spielberg to make, according to a 2012 interview with 60 Minutes, Spielberg's parents divorced when he was 19 and his mother fell in love with one of his father's best friends. Like I said, the real Frank Abagnale estimates this movie is like 70 to 80% accurate. But one of the creative licenses the movie takes is Frank's continuing relationship with his father. In real life, after Frank ran away from home at 16, he never saw his father again. But being the master storyteller that he is, Spielberg knows that movies are about relationships. So he played with the truth a little in order to make sure that Frank's incredible story is always grounded by and filtered through relationships. So while interesting, compelling source material is certainly a good start, storytelling decisions like this really matter because those are what's going to determine whether or not the movie ultimately works. How you decide to tell the interesting, compelling story makes a difference. And if there's one thing I can say about Spielberg's movies, it's that I never think, oh, a different director would have been better suited for this. Even on occasions where I don't love the final product, Spielberg always makes the very best version of whatever story he's telling. Because he's Steven fucking Spielberg. This video is part of a collective called The Director Project. Every month, creators around the world are making video essays about the works of a single director. Check out the playlist linked in the description below for more videos about the work of Steven Spielberg. And if you want to make your own video, tweet it at Cult Popture to be included in the playlist.